In the Transantarctic mountains, at an elevation where the air is thin and the cold descends without ceremony, researchers have pulled fossilized tree trunks from the rock still upright, still rooted where they grew. The wood is 216 million years old. The trees were large. Their growth rings record warm summers, cold winters, seasonal rhythms, a living system that required soil rain and patience. Antarctica, the continent we have come to imagine as the absolute end of the world, was once a forest. That detail is small and it refuses to go away. Tonight we are tracing a question at the edges of what can be known, whether Antarctica was not merely a frozen periphery of the Earth's story, but something closer to its beginning. Whether a continent we have always placed last might once have stood first. We will not resolve this. That is not what this space is for. But we will move through 4 traces what the rock and ice still hold beneath the surface, what certain very old maps appear to show, what the night sky looks like from the bottom of the world, and what a great many human traditions remember about a homeland that dissolved before anyone could write its name down. None of these traces will give us certainty. What they will give us is a pattern, not proof, but a shape that keeps returning from different directions in different materials across distances that should make resemblance unlikely. That is the kind of bit of thing worth sitting with quietly. The world beneath you right now is approximately 4.5 billion years old. The continent we are thinking about tonight has been sealed under ice for somewhere between 34 and 14 million years, depending on which coastal region, which epoch, which brief interval of warmth you are measuring. On that scale, human civilization, everything we can trace with writing and stone is a thin surface film. We keep assuming we know where it begins. We may be measuring from the wrong edge. There is a particular soundness that comes with questions like this. Not the silence of empty rooms, but the silence of a very large place, a continent 5.5 million square kilometers in area, most of it unreachable, most of it unexcavated, all of it sealed under ice that in some places reaches 4 kilometers deep. What lies beneath that ice is not nothing. Modern radar has revealed mountain ranges, ancient river valleys, basins shaped by flowing water over immense spans of time. The continent has a face, we simply cannot see it. That hidden face matters because of what it implies. If the land beneath Antarctica's ice was shaped by rivers, then water once ran there freely, not for decades but for geological spans of time. Forests grew, soil formed, coastlines existed that were by any environmental measure habitable. Not tropical, not easy, but habitable in the way that southern Patagonia is habitable, or coastal Alaska, or the fjords of Norway, places where humans have lived for thousands of years without apology. Some researchers have noted something quiet and strange about a map drawn in Constantinople in 1513. The cartographer and Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled it from roughly 20 older source charts. Some of them he wrote in his own hand, tracing back to the time of Alexander. The southern portion of that map shows a continental landmass, drawn with what appears to be confidence rather than speculation. It shows features that might be coastlines. It shows what some argue may be river systems running inland. Modern surveys of Antarctica's bedrock, the landscape buried beneath kilometers of ice, suggest that in certain regions the hidden coastline aligns more closely with what Piri Reis drew than with the ice edge we can observe today. That alignment is imperfect, it is contested, but it has not been cleanly dismissed. This is the kind of detail that sits uncomfortably in the record. Not proof, a pattern. There are other patterns. Ancient cultures separated by oceans and millennia share a common architecture in certain stories, a world that existed before the present one, a homeland of abundance and order, lost to forces no one could stop. The Greeks placed something like it in the far north and called it Hyperborea. Plato described a civilization older than memory, swallowed by water in a single catastrophic event. Aboriginal Australian traditions carry accounts of coastlines that extended farther south before the seas rose. Andean traditions speak of a world age destroyed by cold and darkness. These stories are not maps. They do not constitute evidence in any strict sense. But they share a structure. And that structure keeps pointing toward loss, toward environmental transformation, toward a direction that is no longer visible from where we stand. What the sky looks like from the bottom of the world is also different from what you see at equatorial latitudes. Stars do not rise and set cleanly. They circle. Time feels less like a line and more like a wheel. If a culture spent long generations under that particular sky, their understanding of cycles of return of the way the world is ordered, it would be shaped accordingly. And some researchers have asked quietly whether certain ancient symbols that appear across the globe, circles, spirals, cross-divided wheels, might carry the fingerprint of exactly that kind of sky, not because anyone drew a map and passed it forward, but because ways of seeing the world travel with people long after the place that shaped them is gone. Tonight we follow these 4 traces, the rock, the maps, the sky, and the myths, not to arrive at a conclusion but to hold the question open, the way Antarctica holds its own past sealed, pressurized, and waiting for the right instrument to read it. So we begin with the ground itself, the continent that time reclassified. The ground itself is where we have to start, not with myth, not with maps, but with rock, with the kind of evidence that does not require interpretation so much as acknowledgement. Antarctica sits at the southern end of the planet, occupying roughly 14 million square kilometers, and for most of the last 2 centuries it has existed in the human imagination as a negative space, a place defined not by what it holds but by what it prohibits. No permanent human settlement, no agriculture, no archaeology in any conventional sense. When scientists travel there, they travel in layers of insulation for weeks at a time to study the ice itself rather than anything beneath it. The continent's value in the modern scientific framework is primarily as a recorder, an archive of atmospheric history, a gauge of planetary temperature across deep time. That framing is accurate. It is also incomplete. To understand why you have to be willing to hold 2 timelines simultaneously in your mind, the one in which Antarctica is what it is right now, and the one in which it was something else entirely. These are not competing claims. They are sequential facts separated by spans of time so large that they are difficult to feel rather than merely count. The place we are thinking about tonight did not begin as a frozen periphery. It began, like every other landmass on this planet, as something warmer and stranger and far more alive than its current condition suggests. Gondwana is the name geologists give to the supercontinent that began breaking apart roughly 180 million years ago. At that time, what is now Antarctica was joined to what is now South America, Africa, Australia, and the Indian subcontinent, a single vast landmass occupying the southern hemisphere in a configuration we can reconstruct from the magnetic signatures locked into ancient basalt and the matching fossil records found on continents now separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. Antarctica was not at the South Pole in the way it sits today. It occupied lower latitudes. Warm ocean currents reached it from multiple directions. Its summers were long and its winters were cool rather than lethal, moderated by proximity to warmer seas, and by the simple thermodynamic fact that ice had not yet arrived to reflect solar energy back into space before the ground could absorb it. The separation happened slowly as continental drift always does. As Antarctica drifted southward and its neighbouring landmasses pulled away, the ocean gaps between them widened into channels, and those channels eventually deepened into the open sea ways we know today. Once those gaps were wide enough, a current formed the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a continuous river of cold water that now encircles the continent, completely isolating it from the warmer surface waters of the Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Oceans. The formation of that current roughly 34 million years ago marks the turning point. Snow began accumulating faster than seasonal warmth could melt it. Ice sheets thickened year by year, and the expanding white surface reflected more and more solar energy back into space, cooling the system further. Each increment of ice made the next increment more likely. The feedback loop was self-reinforcing, and once it established itself, the direction of change became very difficult to reverse. This origin story is well established. It is confirmed by sediment cores drilled from the ocean floor surrounding Antarctica, by isotopic analysis of ancient rock, by the chemistry of ice extracted from quarries drilled through kilometers of accumulated snowfall. It is not a fringe hypothesis. What is less often discussed, what tends to be glossed over in the familiar narrative of Antarctica as eternal wasteland, is the timeline's texture. 34 million years is when large-scale glaciation began. It is not when the continent became uniformly and permanently sealed. During the Miocene epoch, between roughly 23 and 5 million years ago, warming intervals allowed forests to re-establish themselves along Antarctic coastlines. Ice retreated from marginal zones. Rivers ran again across exposed rock. The transition from green to white was not a single irreversible event, but a long oscillation, advancing and retreating across millions of years with extended periods of partial exposure and accessible coastal land. The key figure for the purposes of this episode is not 34 million years. It is closer to 3 million, the point at which Antarctica's glaciation reached approximately the extent and stability we observe today. Before that threshold, there were windows. Some of them lasted hundreds of thousands of years. Stretches of geological time during which the continent's coastal margins were exposed to seasonal light when liquid water moved across its surface in rivers and accumulated in lakes when the ecological conditions existed that tend elsewhere on Earth to attract and sustain complex life. The continent was not tropical. It was not easy. But it was by reasonable environmental measure habitable in the way that southern Patagonia is habitable today, or the fjord coastlines of Norway, or the southern islands of the sub-Antarctic places, where life organises itself around strong seasonal rhythms and makes something workable from cold and long light. Here is where the standard dismissal of any Antarctica origin framework tends to operate, and where that dismissal, while technically defensible, answers the wrong version of the question. The familiar sequence runs Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years. Modern humans have existed for only a few 100,000 years. Therefore, no humans were ever in Antarctica, and no human history begins there. Each step in that sequence is accurate. The conclusion it reaches is also probably correct in the narrow sense. But the question this episode is tracing is not whether Homo sapiens built settlements on Antarctic coastal plains. It is whether Antarctica's deep history, its warmth, its ecosystems, its long cooling, and the movements of life that cooling force shape the conditions from which we eventually emerge. Not as a homeland in the sense of a fixed address on a map, but as a pressure, a directional force, a geological and climatic event whose consequences moved outward across millions of years, influencing what lived, what moved, and ultimately what remembered. That is a harder question than it first appears. It does not resolve into a clean answer. It requires following multiple threads through different kinds of evidence, physical, cartographic, astronomical, mythological, and being honest about what each thread can and cannot bear. We will not force those threads into a single conclusion because the record does not permit that kind of certainty. What the record does permit is careful observation, and careful observation is where we begin. The first trace runs through the ice itself, through what the rock beneath it has preserved, and what the fossils pulled from Antarctic sediment quietly imply about how alive this place once was. What the rock held. A single fossil tree trunk still rooted in the stone where it grew carries more information than its age alone. It carries evidence of soil built up over decades from organic matter decomposing in warmth and moisture. It carries evidence of rainfall sufficient to sustain root systems wide enough to anchor a large canopy. It carries in the spacing of its annual growth rings a record of seasons that alternated predictably between growth and dormancy, not the violent extremes of a polar climate struggling to support life, but the measured rhythm of a temperate system doing what temperate systems do. When researchers in the Transantarctic mountains extract such specimens from rock layers dating to the Thermo-Permian period roughly 260 million years ago, they are not discovering an anomaly. They are reading a chapter of Antarctica's biography that its current surface makes no effort to suggest. The fossil record from Antarctica is more extensive than most people realize, and its contents span an extraordinary range of time and form. Plant fossils, preserved leaves, spores, pollen, grains have been recovered from sediment layers across multiple geological epochs, and the species they represent are consistently associated with climates warmer and wetter than anything the continent currently experiences. Pollen, in particular, is a remarkably durable messenger. The outer wall of a pollen grain is composed of a material called sporopollen, one of the most chemically resistant biological substances, known capable of surviving in sediment for hundreds of millions of years without losing its structural identity. When palynologists, scientists who study ancient pollen, extract and catalogue samples from Antarctic cores, they find assemblages that match the signatures of broadleaf forests, fern understories, and flowering plants that have no business existing within thousands of kilometres of the modern continent. The plants these grains came from needed warmth, They got it here in a place we now associate entirely with cold. Dinosaur fossils have been found in Antarctica as well, not as isolated fragments, but as identifiable species. Some of them herbivores, requiring substantial vegetation to sustain their body mass, others adapted to the kind of mixed woodland environments that characterized much of the southern hemisphere during the Cretaceous. Their presence does not directly concern the question of human origins, but it establishes something important about the continent's capacity. Antarctica was not always a marginal environment clinging to the edge of habitability. For long stretches of deep time, it was a functioning piece of the planetary ecosystem connected to the biological networks that spread across the southern hemisphere before those networks were severed by drift and cold. The more recent evidence, geologically recent meaning the last few tens of millions of years rather than hundreds, comes not from fossils, but from what lies beneath the ice itself. Beginning in the mid-20th century and accelerating dramatically in the last 3 decades, researchers have used ice-penetrating radar airborne gravimetry and satellite-based imaging to construct increasingly detailed maps of Antarctica's subglacial topography. What those maps reveal is a continent with a complex, deeply eroded surface mountain ranges, rivaling the Alps in scale broad valley systems cut by sustained water flow, lowland basins that would, if the ice were removed, open into the shallow coastal seas. The Gambutsev subglacial mountains, buried under kilometres of ice in East Antarctica, were not shaped by glaciers. They were shaped by rivers, by the patient erosion of flowing water across timescales that predate the ice sheet entirely. Their presence implies a landscape that was at some point exposed to the full suite of surface processes that operate in temperate environments, precipitation runoff, sediment, transport, the slow carving of valleys by water finding its way downhill. One of the most striking findings from subglacial mapping involves the drainage networks. Beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, researchers have identified what appear to be ancient river systems channels that run for hundreds of kilometres, branching and converging in the patterns characteristic of watersheds fed by rainfall rather than glacial melt. These are not features created by the ice, they predate it. They are the ghosts of a hydrological system that functioned on the surface before the ice arrived to bury it, and their scale suggests that the landscape that they drained was productive and dynamic. A river system of that extent requires consistent precipitation over a wide catchment area. It requires seasons. It requires the kind of climate that elsewhere on Earth supports dense vegetation and the animal communities that depend on it. The rehook here is quiet but worth holding. The bedrock coastline of Antarctica, the actual edge of the continent, as it would appear, if every gram of ice were removed, differs significantly in many places from the visible ice edge we see on modern maps. In some sectors, the ice-free coastline would extend considerably farther inland than the current margin suggests, revealing bays, inlets and river mouths that have been sealed for millions of years. This is the coastline that some researchers have compared cautiously and with considerable qualification to the southern landmass depicted on certain early modern maps. That comparison will come in a later trace. For now, the point is simply this. The shape of Antarctica that exists beneath the ice is not the shape most people picture when they hear the continent's name, and that gap between the visible and the actual is geologically significant. What the physical record establishes taken together is a portrait of a place that moved through multiple phases of habitability over deep time, and that retains within its rock and sediment the compressed evidence of each phase. The trees grew, the rivers ran, the coastlines were exposed to open water and seasonal light. These are not interpretations, they are measurements confirmed through multiple independent methods by researchers working across different institutions and decades. Antarctica was alive. It was warm enough, wet enough and stable enough to support the kinds of ecosystems that wherever they have existed on this planet have eventually been entered by mobile adaptive organisms searching for resources and space. Whether any such organism, hominid or pre-hominid or something we have not yet classified, ever moved through those coastal zones before the ice closed over them is a question the rock itself cannot answer. But the rock can answer the prior question, and it does the conditions that would have made such movement possible were real. They existed here. And that is where the second trace begins, not in the ground, but on paper, in the form of maps that appear to remember something the ground has since forgotten. The maps that should not exist. Constantinople, 1513. A cartographer working in the service of the Ottoman Navy sits with roughly 20 source charts spread across a table. Portuguese coastal surveys, Arabic navigational guides, and a collection of older documents whose origins he describes in his own handwritten notes as reaching back to the era of Alexander the Great. His name is Piri Reis, and the map he is assembling from these sources will survive the next 5 centuries in the Topkapi Palace Library, largely unexamined until a German theologian notices it during a catalogue review in 1929, and recognises that something about its southern edge does not conform to what the 16th century was supposed to know. The map shows a continental landmass at the bottom of the world drawn with apparent confidence, featuring coastlines and what appear to be inland geographic features in a period that precedes the official European discovery of Antarctica by more than 300 years. The immediate instinct in countering this fact is to reach for an explanation that fits the existing timeline, and there are explanations available. Early modern cartographers were not working from blank slates. They inherited theoretical frameworks from Greek and Roman geographers who argued on philosophical grounds that the northern land masses of Europe and Asia required a southern counterpart to balance the planet's weight. This idea, Terra Australis, a great southern continent whose existence was inferred from symmetry rather than observation, appears on maps throughout the medieval and early modern periods as a precautionary annotation rather than a surveyed reality. The southern landmass on the Piri Reis map in this interpretation is a projection of inherited theory rather than a record of inherited observation, a placeholder filling conceptual space on the lower register of the chart. This is a reasonable argument, and it deserves to be held seriously rather than dismissed as a convenient escape from a difficult question. What complicates the theoretical placeholder interpretation is the level of specificity involved. Philosophical convention tends to produce vague symmetrical landmasses, broad featureless zones of inferred territory drawn to satisfy geometric expectations. The southern region on the Piri Reis map is drawn differently. Its coastline varies. It curves in ways that do not mirror the northern continents. It includes what appear to be embayments, promontories, and inland features that suggest something other than pure theoretical extension. Piri Reis himself, in the inscriptions he added to the map's margins, does not describe the southern landmass as a theoretical construct. He describes it as something his source charts depicted something inherited rather than invented. That distinction matters even if we cannot verify what those source charts contained or how old they actually were. The Oronteus Phineas map, produced in 1531 and therefore roughly contemporary with the Piri Reis chart, extends the problem. This map shows a large southern continent with a distinctive bilobed shape that some researchers have compared to the general outline of Antarctica, as revealed by modern subglacial mapping. More striking than the outline, however, are the interior features. The Phineas map depicts what appear to be river systems flowing from elevated central regions toward the coast, suggesting a continent with active surface drainage rather than a uniform ice cap. Antarctica today has no such surface rivers, but Antarctica's bedrock beneath the ice has them ancient channels carved by water flowing across exposed rock during the long periods before glaciation sealed the landscape. The rivers on the Phineas map, if they are records of anything real rather than artistic convention, would have to represent conditions that existed millions of years ago, long before any known human observer could have surveyed them directly. This is the point at which Charles Hapgood enters the conversation, and where the discussion becomes more complicated rather than simpler. Hapgood, a 20th century American scholar, argued in his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings that the Piri Reis map and several similar charts were derived from a lost source civilization with sophisticated cartographic knowledge, a culture capable of accurately surveying Antarctica before its glaciation and transmitting that knowledge forward across millennia in fragmentary form. His methodology attracted significant criticism from academic cartographers and historians, who identified selective measurement projection errors in his comparisons and an insufficient accounting for how early modern mapmakers actually worked. Those criticisms are substantive. Hapgood's specific framework has not been adopted by mainstream scholarship, and the reasons for that rejection are legitimate rather than merely conservative. What his critics did not fully resolve, however, is the narrower question that survives his discredited methodology. Why do these maps produced in the early 16th century depict a southern landmass with features that align imperfectly selectively, but recurrently with the subglacial topography that radar surveys would not reveal until 4 centuries later. The alignment is not perfect. It is not consistent across all features. In some regions it breaks down entirely, but in others it holds closely enough that researchers examining both the historical maps and the modern radar data have noted the correspondence without being able to explain it away entirely through projection error or artistic convention. That residual correspondence is the rehook this trace leaves open, not proof, but an alignment that recurs in the data more often than coincidence comfortably accommodates. The knowledge preservation question is perhaps the most intellectually honest way to approach the cartographic evidence. We know that knowledge survives across long spans of time in fragmentary and degraded form. Babylonian astronomical records preserve observational data accumulated over centuries. Indigenous oral traditions have been shown to encode accurate accounts of geological events thousands of years old. The survival of geographic information through multiple generations of copying, translation, and partial understanding is not a hypothetical mechanism. It is a documented one. What remains genuinely open is whether the specific information embedded in these early maps represents the kind of inherited geographic memory that such mechanisms could plausibly transmit, or whether the apparent accuracy is a combination of coincidence, selective reading, and the human tendency to find patterns in ambiguous material. That question cannot be resolved from the maps alone, but the maps are not the only place where an older geography seems to have left its impression, and the third trace moves into a domain entirely different from cartography, into the structure of the sky itself and what it reveals about the minds that once learned to read it. The sky that turns without stopping. Consider what it would mean to grow up under a sky that has no fixed point. In the Northern Hemisphere, navigation by stars has for most of recorded human history relied on a single reliable anchor, Polaris, the North Star, sitting close enough to the celestial pole that it appears nearly motionless while every other star in the sky rotates around it. Sailors used it. Farmers used it. The entire conceptual apparatus of cardinal direction of north as a stable and locatable absolute rests partly on the existence of that one bright stationary point overhead. Remove it and orientation becomes a different kind of problem, not unsolvable but structurally different, requiring a different cognitive approach to the question of where you are and which way you are facing. The southern sky has no equivalent of Polaris. The south celestial pole, the point around which the southern hemisphere's stars rotate, sits in a relatively empty region of the sky, unmarked by any bright star visible to the naked eye. This has been true for most of human history, and it means that anyone navigating or observing from high southern latitudes has had to work with a sky that offers rotation without anchor, movement without fixed reference. The stars do not rise and set cleanly the way they appear to do from equatorial latitudes. Instead, at sufficient southern latitudes, the majority of visible stars circle the horizon, continuously tracing elliptical paths that never bring them fully above or below the skyline. The sky becomes a wheel, and a wheel, unlike a river, has no beginning and no end. This distinction between a linear sky and a rotational one is not merely aesthetic. It shapes in subtle but measurable ways how people who live beneath each type of sky organize their understanding of time. A sky in which stars rise, cross overhead, and set encourages a narrative model of temporal experience. Things begin, progress, and conclude. Events have direction. History moves forward. A sky in which stars circle endlessly without disappearing encourages something different. A cyclical model in which events return, patterns repeat, and the appropriate response to change is not linear progress, but attentive rotation. You do not wait for something new to arrive, you wait for something familiar to come around again. This cognitive difference matters for the argument this episode is tracing, but it matters in a way that requires care. The claim is not that ancient people who observed a rotational southern sky inevitably developed cyclical cosmologies, and therefore that any ancient culture with a cyclical cosmology must have originated in southern polar latitudes. That would be reasoning backwards from effect to cause, in a way the evidence cannot support. Cyclical cosmologies appear in cultures across many latitudes for many reasons, and the southern sky is only one possible influence among dozens. What can be said more carefully is that a population spending long generations under a sky that behaves rotationally would have a particularly strong environmental reinforcement for cyclical thinking. and that this reinforcement would express itself in the symbolic systems that culture produced. The symbols themselves are where this trace becomes most interesting and most contested. Circles appear as a dominant motif in ancient symbolic systems worldwide, carved into stone in Neolithic Ireland at Newgrange, scratched onto rock faces in the American Southwest, pressed into clay in early Mesopotamian contexts, arranged in the architectural geometry of megalithic sites from Malta to the Orkney Islands. Spirals, which might be understood as circles that record their own movement, appear with similar frequency and similar geographic distribution. Cross-divided circles' wheels, essentially with the cardinal directions marked inside a circumference, show up in contexts ranging from Bronze Age Scandinavia to pre-Columbian South America to early Bronze Age Anatolia. The recurrence is real. What it means is genuinely debated. The standard archaeological interpretation treats these symbols as independent inventions, parallel solutions to parallel cognitive problems arising wherever humans needed to represent cycles, directions, or cosmological order in a durable visual form. A circle is, after all, one of the simplest shapes a hand can produce, and its association with the sun, the moon, and seasonal cycles is so direct that no shared origin is required to explain its appearance in multiple cultures. This argument is sound, and it should not be abandoned lightly. Independent invention is the default explanation in archaeology precisely because the alternative diffusion from a single source requires evidence of contact or transmission that is usually absent from the record. What the independent invention explanation handles less cleanly is not the symbols themselves, but the specific context in which they appear most insistently, astronomical alignments. The builders of Newgrange oriented their chamber to emit a single shaft of light at winter solstice sunrise. The architects of Stonehenge aligned their primary axis to midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset. The builders of the megalithic temples at Menajdra in Malta oriented their facades to receive equinox light directly through their main doorways. These are not coincidental orientations. They are precise, deliberate, and consistent across cultures that had no known direct contact with one another. Something drove widely separated peoples to invest enormous labour in structures whose primary function appears to have been the marking of solar cycles, not for practical agriculture alone, but with a reverence that suggests the cycles themselves carried meaning beyond the merely useful. The rehook here is architectural rather than astronomical. The effort required to build Newgrange, an estimated 200,000 tons of material moved without metal tools, is disproportionate to any strictly practical purpose. Something else was being honoured. A culture formed under polar or near-polar skies where the sun's behaviour is genuinely extreme, where it disappears entirely for weeks and then returns where its lowest and highest points on the horizon are separated by dramatic arcs over the course of a year, would have a particularly acute relationship with solstice timing. Missing the turn of the sun in such an environment is not a symbolic failure. It is a navigational one, a failure of the collective memory that keeps track of when light returns and how long the dark will last. When such a culture migrates to lower latitudes where the sun's behaviour is less extreme, the urgency of solstice marking would diminish. But the practice embedded in ritual and architecture and the accumulated weight of tradition might persist long after the original environmental pressure had relaxed. This is the complicating edge of the third trace. It does not point toward Antarctica with the same kind of directness that a fossil record points toward ancient warmth, or the old maps point toward a possible subglacial coastline. It points instead toward a shared orientation in how ancient peoples related to the sky, an orientation that is consistent with, though not exclusive to, an origin in high southern latitudes. The consistency is not proof. It's a question about the shape of something that might have happened asked by the monuments themselves, in a language that is almost but not quite readable. That near readability is what draws us in the next chapter to set these three traces side by side for the first time, not to force them into alignment, but to see whether the shape they make together is more interesting than any one of them produces alone. First, convergence. 3 traces. 1 outline. Pull back far enough from any 3 separate things and they either remain separate or they begin to suggest a shape. The 3 traces this episode has followed so far: the physical record buried beneath Antarctic ice, The cartographic anomalies of the early 16th century and the astronomical orientation encoded in ancient monuments worldwide were developed independently by researchers working in different disciplines across different centuries, none of them primarily concerned with the others. A paleobotanist extracting fossilized pollen from Antarctic sediment cores is not in general thinking about Ottoman maps. A cartographic historian examining the Piri Reis chart is not in general thinking about the solstice alignment at Newgrange. An archaeoastronomer measuring the orientation of megalithic chambers is not in general thinking about subglacial river systems revealed by radar. And yet when these three bodies of evidence are placed in the same room and examined together, they produce something that none of them produces alone, not a conclusion but a coherent direction. A consistent lean toward the same set of questions arriving from three different starting points. The first trace established that Antarctica was once alive, not in the marginal sense of harbouring microbes in cold puddles, but alive in the full ecological sense of forests, rivers, seasonal cycles, and the complex food webs that such systems support. The timeline of that warmth is real and well documented. The subglacial topography preserved beneath the current ice sheet confirms that the continent's surface was shaped by sustained liquid water by drainage networks and coastal formations that required millennia of temperate conditions to develop. The physical record does not tell us who, if anyone, moved through that landscape. What it establishes is that the landscape was for extended periods during the last several million years, the kind of place that mobile adaptive organisms tend to enter when they have the means to reach it. The second trace establishes that certain maps produced in the early 16th century contain a southern landmass, whose features coastline shape interior drainage patterns, overall geographic placement align in selective but recurrent ways with the subglacial topography that modern radar surveys have revealed beneath the Antarctic ice. The alignment is imperfect and contested. The methodology used by the researcher who most prominently argued for that alignment has been criticised on legitimate grounds. But the maps themselves are real, and the cartographers who produced them describe their sources as old, older than the 16th century, older than European maritime expansion into the southern Atlantic, in some cases attributed to traditions reaching back to the classical world. Whether those source attributions are accurate, inflated, or entirely unreliable is a question that cartographic history cannot currently answer with confidence. What the maps leave open is the possibility that some component of their southern detail was inherited, rather than invented, copied, degraded, and partially misunderstood from a chain of earlier charts whose ultimate origin remains unverified. The third trace established that a particular orientation towards cyclical time, expressed in the symbolic systems and architectural alignments of ancient cultures across multiple continents, is consistent with, though not exclusively produced by long-term observation of a rotational sky at high southern latitudes. The solstice-aligned monuments of Neolithic Europe, the cross-divided wheels of Bronze Age Scandinavia, and pre-Columbian America, the persistent global recurrence of circles and spirals as the dominant motifs in early symbolic art, none of these require a southern polar origin, but they accumulate into a pattern of cosmological emphasis on cycles returns and the marking of solar extremes that would be particularly well explained by a culture formed under a sky that behaves rotationally rather than linearly. Here is where the convergence becomes interesting and where it requires the most careful handling. Each trace considered alone is genuinely ambiguous. The fossilized forests could be ancient history with no relevance to anything human. The old maps could be philosophical constructs dressed in the borrowed authority of fictitious ancient sources. The astronomical alignments could be independent inventions driven by universal cognitive tendencies rather than shared inheritance. These are all defensible readings, and none of them can be ruled out on the basis of the available evidence. The standard of proof required to overturn them is high, and that standard has not been met. What the convergence does, however, is change the character of the ambiguity. When three independent lines of inquiry, physical, cartographic, and symbolic, all lean in the same direction, the ambiguity is no longer simply the absence of evidence. It becomes something more specific, the presence of a pattern that would be expected if a particular history were true, and that has no single clean alternative explanation. The pattern does not prove the history, but it does make the history harder to dismiss as merely speculative, because Speculation that aligns with three independent evidential streams has a different epistemic status than speculation that aligns with none. The unique anchor of this convergence chapter is geographic rather than material. Every one of these three traces, when followed to its implication, points toward the same physical zone, the coastal margins of Antarctica during periods of reduced glaciation. The fossilized ecosystems were concentrated in coastal and near-coastal environments. The subglacial drainage networks that the old maps may reflect are most pronounced in the coastal sectors of West Antarctica and the Antarctic Peninsula. The navigational and astronomical challenges most strongly associated with high southern latitudes are most acute along coastlines where the combination of maritime resources and open horizons would concentrate any human or pre-human population. The coastline is the convergence point, not the interior plateau, not the deep ice, but the edge of a continent that has been sealed away from direct investigation by 5 million cubic kilometres of accumulated ice. That convergence point is also, of course, the most inaccessible place on the planet for archaeological investigation. The ice shelves that now cover much of the Antarctic coastal margin extend hundreds of kilometres seaward. The bedrock beneath them lies under hundreds to thousands of metres of ice. No excavation has been attempted. No sampling protocol for detecting ancient habitation traces has been developed for this environment. The coastal convergence zone that three independent traces point toward is, in the most literal sense, unreachable by current methods. That inaccessibility does not validate the pattern, but it does explain, at least in part, why the pattern has not yet been tested against direct physical evidence, and why the question remains structurally open rather than empirically closed. Before we can go further with that pattern, however, we are obligated to sit with the strongest arguments against it. Because those arguments are substantive, and because any honest engagement with this territory requires understanding exactly what the pattern cannot explain and where its logic begins to strain. What the skeptics sees clearly. The most important voice in any investigation that runs close to the edge of the verifiable is the one that keeps asking whether the pattern is real or whether the pattern is the investigator. That voice deserves a full chapter, not because it ends the conversation, it does not, but because the conversation is only worth having if the counter-arguments are genuinely understood rather than performed as obstacles on the way to a predetermined conclusion. The skeptic in this context is not an adversary. The skeptic is the standard of intellectual seriousness against which everything else in this episode must be measured, and the standard is a high one. The first and most structurally decisive counter-argument concerns time. The window during which Antarctica's coastal margins were genuinely temperate, accessible, vegetated, capable of supporting complex ecological communities closed somewhere between 3 and 5 million years ago, depending on the region and the metric used. The hominid lineage that would eventually produce modern Homo sapiens appears in the fossil record roughly 4 million years ago in Africa. The earliest stone tool traditions, the oldest evidence of anything that could plausibly be called a distinctly human way of engaging with the environment, date to approximately 3.3 million years ago, again in Africa or again at latitudes that are nowhere near the southern polar regions. The overlap between Antarctica was habitable, and something capable of cultural behaviour existed, is therefore either non-existent or confined to a narrow and extremely early window in which the hominids present were almost certainly not capable of navigating to, let alone purposefully settling, a coastal continent separated from the African landmass by thousands of kilometres of open ocean. This is not a minor objection. It is the foundational objection, and it carries real weight. The second counter-argument addresses the cartographic evidence directly, and it does so with a precision that the maps as memory interpretation has difficulty matching. Early modern cartographers worked within a tradition of theoretical geography inherited from Ptolemy and Strabo, both of whom argued that the known northern land masses required a southern counterpart to maintain the planet's gravitational and climatic balance. This concept, terra australis incognita, the unknown southern land, was a standing feature of educated European geographic thought for centuries before any European ship reached the Antarctic convergence zone. When Piri Reis and Orontes Phineas drew southern land masses, they were operating within an intellectual framework that expected the large southern continent to exist. The features those landmasses display: coastlines, river systems, Interior elevations are consistent with what a skilled cartographer would draw to fill in a theoretically required space, using artistic convention and the geographic logic of temperate landforms as his guide, rather than any actual surveyed data. The apparent correspondence between these features and Antarctica's subglacial topography in this reading is a form of retroactive pattern, matching the human eye finding alignment in two complex irregular shapes, and interpreting that alignment as significant when it may simply be probabilistic double noise in a large dataset of possible comparisons. Charles Hapgood's measurements specifically have been re-examined by later researchers who found that his alignment claims depended on selecting which features to compare and which to ignore, a methodological choice that substantially inflates the apparent correspondence. The third counterargument takes on the astronomical and symbolic evidence, and it operates at the level of cognitive universals. Circles are among the first shapes that human hands produce across every culture and every developmental stage, because they are among the easiest shapes to generate with a pointed instrument and a fixed pivot. Spirals emerge naturally from the same basic motion extended outward. Cross-divided circles appear wherever people need to represent the four directions or the four seasons, or any other quaternary structure, because the cross inside the circle is the most direct visual encoding of that structure available. The solstice and equinox alignments of megalithic monuments, meanwhile, are explained adequately by local astronomical observation by communities that lived closely enough to seasonal cycles to notice the sun's extreme positions on the horizon, and that invested in marking those positions as a way of coordinating agricultural and ritual life. None of these patterns require a shared origin in high southern latitudes. None of them require any origin more remote than the immediate environment of the people who produced them. The independent invention hypothesis for symbolic and architectural evidence of this kind is not merely a default assumption. It's the hypothesis that requires the least additional machinery to explain what we actually observe. These three objections taken together constitute a serious challenge to the interpretive framework this episode has been developing. They are not easily deflected, and they should not be deflected. They should be held in full weight alongside everything the three traces suggest. The intellectual honesty this space is built on requires acknowledging that the skeptic's case as stated above is stronger than the pattern-based case on any individual point. The time problem is real. The cartographic tradition problem is real. The cognitive universals problem is real. What the skeptic's case handles less cleanly, however, is not any individual point but the combination of them. The time problem explains why modern Homo sapiens were not in Antarctica. It does not fully explain what earlier hominids were doing at the edges of the habitable world during the long windows before glaciation closed. The cartographic tradition problem explains why Piri Reis and Phineas would draw a southern continent. It does not fully explain why certain features of that continent correspond more closely to the subglacial bedrock than to the ice surface that would have been the only observable feature of Antarctica, even in a theoretical construct. The cognitive universals problem explains why circles and spirals appear independently. It does not fully explain the specific convergence of solstice orientation across megalithic traditions, separated by thousands of kilometers, expressed not just in symbols, but in the labor-intensive, precisely calculated alignment of permanent stone architecture. Each counter-argument leaves a residue, a small zone of the pattern that it addresses but does not dissolve. Those residual zones are not evidence of anything in the strict sense. They are simply the parts of the pattern that remain after the strongest critical pressure has been applied. The pattern at this point in the investigation is neither confirmed nor refuted. It is reduced, clarified, and rendered more specific by the skeptical pressure brought to bear against it, and what survives that pressure is worth following a little further. Not because survival proves validity, but because the shape of what survives is itself informative. That shape is where we turn next. What survives? Pressure. At the edge of the Ross ice shelf, where the ice meets open water in a fractured boundary of blue and white, the contrast between what can be seen and what lies beneath is not abstract. The shelf extends for hundreds of kilometers flat and opaque on its upper surface, concealing below it a submerged coastline that has not been directly observed by any living eye. Researchers working from ships in the Ross Sea can measure the shelf's thickness. By acoustics as sounding, can infer the shape of the bedrock beneath the ice. by gravitational anomaly can reconstruct the history of the shelf's advanced and retreat across glacial cycles from sediment cores drilled through the seafloor. But they cannot see the coastline directly. They work as scientists in this region always work from inference and instrument rather than from observation. What the skeptic's case established stated precisely is this. None of the three traces developed in this episode constitute evidence in the strong sense. The fossil record demonstrates ancient habitability but not human presence. The early maps demonstrate inherited cartographic tradition, but not necessarily inherited geographic knowledge. The astronomical alignments demonstrate a widespread human concern with solar cycles, but not necessarily a shared origin for that concern. On each of these points, the skeptic is correct, and the correct response is not to contest the point, but to accept it and then ask what remains after it is accepted, because something does remain, and its character changes once the overreaching claims have been set aside. What remains is a specific kind of coincidence, not the vague coincidence of loosely similar things appearing in loosely similar contexts, but the structural coincidence of three independent investigative threads developed in three different disciplines, over three different staunch centuries, consistently pointing toward the same geographic zone as the locus of an unexplained residue. The fossilized ecosystems are most extensive in coastal Antarctica. The subglacial topography most frequently compared to early modern maps is in the coastal sectors of West Antarctica and the peninsula. The astronomical and symbolic convergence most strongly associated with high southern latitudes would be most acute in coastal environments where maritime resources and open horizons intersect with the extreme seasonal light of near polar latitudes. Three threads, one zone. That coincidence does not validate any specific claim about who was there or what they did, but it has a shape that is more specific than the shape of chance typically produces. The recovery from the skeptic's challenge, in other words, is not a restoration of the original claims, it is a refinement of them. The episode began with a question whether Antarctica might have been the cradle of civilization framed in a deliberately broad terms. The three traces developed that question through three kinds of evidence. The skeptic's chapter trimmed those traces back to what each can actually bear, and what remains after that trimming is a smaller, more precise and arguably more interesting question. Why does the residue from three independent investigative threads consistently point toward the same inaccessible place? The unique anchor this chapter offers is demographic rather than cartographic. Population geneticists studying ancient DNA have over the last 2 decades reconstructed migration patterns in the human past with increasing resolution, and those reconstructions contain a recurring anomaly that standard models handle with some difficulty. In several regions, southern South America, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, certain island populations of the Pacific, the genetic diversity patterns suggest population bottlenecks and dispersal events whose timing and directionality do not align cleanly with the migrations derived from the primary out-of-Africa framework. Some populations appear to carry genetic signatures of source populations that have not been identified in the archaeological record. This does not mean those source populations were in Antarctica. It means the map of early human movement has gaps that genomic data keeps finding and that the fossil record keeps failing to fill. The gaps are real, their causes are not established. But the direction from which certain anomalous genetic signals appear to have originated has in several independent studies pointed southward toward latitudes that the conventional account of human migration treats as irrelevant. This is the Hook's southward genetic signals pointing toward latitudes the standard model does not account for are not evidence of an Antarctic origin. They are evidence of movement from somewhere that is not well represented in the current fossil record, in a direction that the conventional timeline has not fully explained. That is a narrower claim than the one this episode started with, and it is a more defensible one. It does not require ancient Homo sapiens in Antarctica. It requires only that the southern hemisphere's role in early human population dynamics has been underestimated, which is a claim that several mainstream researchers have made independently, without any reference to lost civilizations or subglacial cartography. What the skeptic established then is not that the pattern is wrong, it is that the pattern has been overloaded with claims that the evidence cannot support. Strip those claims away, and what remains is a set of empirical residues in the geology, in the cartography, in the archaeoastronomy, and the population genetics that consistently underperform the explanations assigned to them. They are not anomalies in the dramatic sense of things that overturn established knowledge. They are quiet underperformers, data points that the standard models explain partially but not completely, that keep leaving a small surplus of unexplained structure behind after the best available framework has been applied. It is that surplus small distributed across multiple disciplines is pointing toward the same inaccessible zone that justifies continuing. Not because the surplus is large enough to constitute a discovery, but because the consistency of its direction is unusual enough to warrant a closer look at what the fourth and final trace adds to the picture. That trace does not come from rock or paper or stone monuments. It comes from the oldest recording medium available to the human species, from the stories that cultures tell about where they came from and what they lost on the way to becoming what they are now. The stories that kept the direction. Across at least 65,000 years of continuous habitation, Aboriginal Australians maintained oral traditions that described landscapes no living person had ever seen. Coastlines that extended far beyond the current shoreline rivers, that flowed through valleys now submerged, beneath tens of meters of seawater islands that no longer existed in any navigable form. For most of the period in which European scholars were aware of these traditions, they were classified as mythology symbolic narratives encoding cultural values rather than geographic memory. That classification began to change seriously in the early 21st century, when researchers began systematically comparing the specific landscape features described in certain Aboriginal stories with the results of bathymetric surveys mapping the continental shelf around Australia. The correspondence they found was not approximate. In several cases, the stories described precise locations, water depths, and coastal formations that matched the submerged topography with an accuracy that the mythology classification could not comfortably accommodate. These were memories of real places preserved in oral tradition across a span of time roughly 10 to 12,000 years since the end of the last glacial maximum that had previously been considered beyond the reach of reliable cultural transmission. The implications of that finding extend well beyond Australia, and they matter directly to the fourth trace this episode has been building toward. If oral tradition can accurately preserve specific geographic information across 10,000 years of continuous cultural transmission, then the theoretical upper limit on what human memory collective ritualized institutionally maintained can carry forward across time is considerably higher than most academic frameworks have assumed. 10,000 years is not the ceiling of oral memory. It is a demonstrated flaw. The actual ceiling in cultures where preservation is treated as a sacred obligation rather than an incidental practice may be substantially higher. How much higher is a question that remains genuinely open, and its openness is relevant to every tradition from every continent that describes a world different from the one its tellers inhabited. The fourth trace is built from those traditions, from the structural patterns that appear with remarkable consistency in the origin stories and cosmological narratives of cultures separated by oceans millennia, and the full range of human ecological diversity. The pattern is not one of identical stories, it is one of identical architecture. An earlier world existed before the present one. That world was ordered differently, more abundant, more directly connected to whatever the culture identifies as cosmic or divine order. It was lost not through human failure alone, but through environmental transformation. Water rising cold, advancing a sky that changed its behaviour, a land that became unreachable. The survivors of that transformation carried forward what they could in the form of knowledge, practice and story, and built what exists now from those remnants. The present world is therefore always in these traditions a reduced and somewhat diminished version of something that was once more complete. This structure appears in Plato's account of Atlantis, a civilization older than Greece, technically advanced, destroyed by catastrophic flooding in a single generation located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in an ocean that the Greeks associated with the edges of the known world. It appears in the Norse concept of a primordial realm of ice, from which creation itself emerged, followed by a world that will eventually return to cold and darkness in the cycle of Ragnarok. It appears in the Hindu framework of cosmic ages, the yugas, in which the current age, the Kali Yuga, is the most diminished of 4 successive world periods, each one more degraded than the last, moving away from an original state of completeness rather than toward one. It appears in the Andean traditions that describe a world age destroyed by cold and darkness, from which a remnant population emerged into a changed landscape and had to reconstruct the terms of existence from what they remembered. It appears in modified form, Zoroastrian concept of the Vara, an underground refuge built to preserve life through a coming winter of cosmic duration described in the Vendidad as a response to a divine warning that cold would destroy the world above ground. The hook in this body of material is geographical rather than narrative. When researchers map the locations that these traditions associate with the origin or loss of the previous world, a disproportionate number of them point southward or toward the ocean's edge, toward coastlines, toward submerged territories, toward the kind of marginal geography that sea level rise and glacial advance would have rendered inaccessible over the course of the last 12 to 15,000 years. Atlantis is placed beyond the Western Ocean's edge. The Zoroastrian Vara is associated with a land of long winters, advancing from a direction the text identifies with cold, which in the geographic context of the ancient Near East means north, or depending on the cosmological orientation of the text, the farthest reachable edge of the habitable world. The Aboriginal traditions of extended southern coastlines point not merely to submerged Australian shelf, but in some formulations to territories farther south than any current landmass accounts for. These are not convergent testimonies toward a single coordinate. They are convergent orientations toward the same general class of landscape, the coastal edges of a colder, more southerly world that environmental change made unreachable. What makes this trace structurally different from the previous three is its medium. Fossils, maps, and stone monuments are physical objects that can be measured, dated, and compared against independent data sets. Oral traditions and mythological narratives are not. They cannot be carbon dated. Their transmission history is unverifiable beyond a certain depth. The correspondence between a story and a real landscape can always be attributed to coincidence, symbolic elaboration, or the universal human tendency to locate mythological events in dramatic geographic settings. These are legitimate limitations, and they mean the mythological evidence cannot carry the same epistemic weight as the physical evidence. What it can do and what makes it worth placing in the same investigation as the fossil record, the maps, and the astronomical alignments is provide a fourth independent vector pointing in the same direction as the other three. Four vectors do not constitute proof, they constitute a direction that when followed carefully and without overreach, leads to the same inaccessible coastal zone that the other traces have been circling the sealed, pressurized radar-surveyed edge of a continent whose deepest history has not yet been directly read. The mythology does not tell us what happened there. It tells us that something somewhere at the edges of the world was lost, and that the loss was significant enough to survive 10,000 years of research telling in cultures that never compared notes. That persistence is the thing worth examining most carefully, and it is the thing this episode has been building towards since the first fossilized tree root was pulled from Antarctic stone. The chapter that follows does not add more evidence. It does something different. It holds the four traces together in the same light and asks what, if anything, connects them at a level deeper than disciplinary coincidence. The pattern that has no owner. 343 kilometers. That is the approximate length of the subglacial canyon system discovered beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet by radar surveys completed in the early 2000s, a drainage feature running from the interior plateau toward what was once the Weddell Sea coastline, carved by sustained river flow across a landscape that has been sealed under ice for millions of years. The canyon is not unique. It is one of dozens of similar features mapped across the continent's buried surface, each one a record of a hydrological system that functioned at a scale comparable to major river networks currently operating in temperate regions of the world. The Greenland ice sheet has one canyon singular, and famous, running for approximately 750 kilometers beneath its northern sector and compared in scale to the Grand Canyon. Antarctica has a network, a distributed, branching continent-wide system of ancient water movement whose complexity implies not a brief interlude of surface melting but a prolonged period, measured in geological time of active organized drainage across a temperate landscape. These canyons are not anomalies. They are infrastructure in the geological sense, the accumulated result of water doing what water does across vast spans of time in an environment that allowed it to flow freely. Each of the four traces developed in this episode has a respectable mainstream interpretation that accounts for most of what it contains. The fossil record is explained by continental drift and ancient climate. The early maps are explained by cartographic tradition and theoretical geography. The astronomical alignments are explained by universal cognitive responses to seasonal cycles. The mythological convergence is explained by the universality of flood and displacement experiences across all human cultures. These explanations are not wrong. They cover the majority of the available data, and they do so with genuine explanatory power. The problem, the specific, quiet, structurally persistent problem, is that each of them leaves a residue. A small zone of the pattern that the explanation addresses, but does not absorb. And when those residues are placed side by side, they share a geometry that no single explanation currently accounts for. The residue from the fossil record is the subglacial topography, specifically the fact that Antarctica's buried coastline in several sectors of the continent corresponds more closely to certain features on early modern maps than the visible ice surface does. This correspondence is the residue that the ancient climate explanation does not address, because ancient climate explains the existence of the buried coastline, but not what a 16th century map appears to reflect it. The residue from the cartographic evidence is the specificity of the inland features river systems, elevated interior regions, coastal embayments that exceed what theoretical convention would require, and that correspond structurally to features now confirmed by radar. This is the residue that the Terra Australis tradition explanation does not absorb, because the tradition explains why a southern continent would be drawn, but not why it would be drawn with features that match a landscape no 16th century European had ever seen. The residue from the astronomical evidence is the labour investment, the specific measurable fact that communities across multiple continents dedicated resources far exceeding practical necessity to the precise alignment of permanent stone architecture with solar extremes, a priority that is consistent with but not fully explained by local agricultural calendaring alone. And the residue from the mythological evidence is the directionality, the specific recurrent orientation of origin-lost traditions toward cold, toward southern ocean edges, toward landscapes rendered inaccessible by advancing ice or rising seas in cultures whose geographic knowledge of the deep southern hemisphere was by any standard account essentially non-existent. 4 residues, 4 separate disciplines, 4 independent research traditions, none of them primarily concerned with the others, each leaving a small surplus of unexplained structure after its best available explanation has been applied. The rehook this chapter offers is not a new piece of evidence, but a mathematical observation. The probability of 4 independent residues sharing a common geometric direction by chance decreases as the specificity of that direction increases. These 4 residues do not merely point vaguely southward, they point specifically toward the coastal margins of Antarctica during the period of reduced glaciation toward a datable, mappable, geologically constrained window of time and space. The window runs from approximately 3 million years ago, when Antarctic glaciation reached roughly its current extent, back to approximately 14 million years ago, when the most recent extended warm interval in the continent's Miocene history allowed forests to re-establish along its coastlines. That is the window, and the window's boundaries are defined not by the traces, but by the independent geological record, by the ice core data and the sediment analysis and the paleoclimatic modelling that mainstream science uses to reconstruct Antarctic climate history. The traces did not define the window. The window was already there, defined by entirely separate methods when the traces pointed toward it. This is the pattern that has no owner. No single researcher constructed it deliberately. No single discipline contains all its components. It emerged from the intersection of evidence streams that were developed independently for unrelated purposes. A palynologist's interest in ancient vegetation, a cartographic historian's interest in early modern map sources, an archaeo-astronomer's interest in megalithic alignment, an anthropologist's interest in oral tradition preservation, and its convergence toward a specific geographic zone and a specific temporal window was not predicted by any of them. It was noticed gradually by researchers looking across disciplinary boundaries rather than within them, and it has not yet attracted the kind of sustained cross-disciplinary investigation that would be required to either explain it or dismiss it with precision. What makes this the highest point of the episode's argument is not drama, it is specificity. Vague patterns are easy to generate from large datasets. They are the noise of patterns seeking cognition applied to complex material. Specific patterns, ones that point to datable windows, mappable zones and convergent residues from independent datasets, are harder to produce accidentally and harder to dismiss without engaging each component individually. The pattern this episode has assembled is specific in exactly that way. It does not prove anything. It cannot, with the available evidence, be made to prove anything. But it has a precision that distinguishes it from speculation because the precision was built into the components before they were assembled by researchers who were not assembling them toward this conclusion. The window is real, the residues are real, the convergence is real. What it means, whether it means anything beyond the coincidence of 4 underperforming explanations in the same geographic direction, is the question that the remaining chapters will not answer, but will hold open. In the only way that is intellectually honest, by describing what it feels like to stand at the edge of a pattern, this large and this unresolved, and to look at the ice, and to understand that whatever the ice contains, it is not yet speaking. The landscape, not the evidence. Step back far enough from any complex terrain and the individual features, the ridgelines, the river valleys, the scarps and plateaus cease to be separate objects and become a single topography. You stop counting components and start reading contour. The shift is not a loss of precision. It is a change in the kind of precision being applied. Close reading of individual features tells you what each one is. Reading the contour tells you what kind of place you are in. Both kinds of reading are necessary, and they produce different knowledge. The 10 chapters preceding this one have been engaged in close reading, examining the fossil record in its geological specificity, the maps in their cartographic detail, the astronomical alignments in their architectural precision, the oral traditions in their narrative structure. This chapter does something different. It steps back to the contour and asks what kind of place this investigation has arrived at. The place it has arrived at is not a conclusion. It is a terrain with a particular character, one defined less by what it confirms than by what it consistently fails to resolve. Every discipline that has been brought to bear on the question of Antarctica's deep history has found at the boundary of its explanatory reach the same kind of remainder, a small specific directional surplus that its best frameworks address but do not exhaust. The paleoclimatologist's framework exhausts everything about the fossilized forests except their relationship to the subglacial topography that certain old maps appear to reflect. The cartographic historian's framework exhausts everything about the Piri Reis chart except but the specificity of its inland features. The archaeoastronomer's framework exhausts everything about megalithic solstice alignment except the disproportion between the labour invested and the practical agricultural benefit returned. The anthropologist's framework exhausts everything about flood and displacement mythology, except the recurrent southward directionality of the landscape those myths locate. 4 frameworks, 4 remainders, all pointing the same way. That is the contour. The unique anchor this chapter offers is temporal rather than geographic. When the 4 traces are arranged not by discipline but by the timescale they operate on, a hierarchy emerges that has not been fully articulated until now. The fossil record operates on the longest timescale, millions of years of climate history, continental drift and ecosystem succession. The cartographic evidence operates on a medium timescale, centuries of map-making tradition, source, transmission, and geographic inheritance reaching back by the cartographer's own account into the classical world. The astronomical and symbolic evidence operates on a timescale of thousands of years, the construction, use and ritualization of solstice-aligned monuments across multiple Neolithic cultures. The mythological evidence operates on the shortest timescale among the 4 tens of thousands of years, at most the span across which oral tradition has been demonstrated to carry reliable geographic information. These 4 timescales are nested inside one another like concentric rings, and what is striking about their nesting is that each inner ring appears to carry a reduced but consistent echo of the information contained in the outer ones. The geological record of ancient warmth is the outermost ring. The mythological memory of a lost southern homeland is the innermost. Between them, the maps and the monuments occupy the middle distances, each one a kind of translation of the same information into a different medium and a different temporal resolution. This nesting structure is the re-hook, not a single dramatic anomaly, but a series of concentric correspondences, each one operating at a different scale, each one carrying a different level of resolution, but all of them describing the same general shape when viewed from sufficient distance. The shape is of something that was once present in the south that became inaccessible through environmental change, and that left traces distributed across time in the form of geology, cartography, architecture, and story, each trace less specific than the one before it. As the original information was translated across successively more lossy media. This is not a novel interpretive framework. It is in fact the standard model for how cultural memory behaves over deep time, high-resolution physical evidence at one end, low-resolution symbolic residue at the other, with a gradient of specificity between them corresponding to the distance from the original event. The only unusual feature of the current case is that the gradient runs backward relative to the usual archaeological expectation. Normally, the physical evidence is recent and the symbolic residue is old. Here, the physical evidence is the oldest layer locked in rock and sediment that predates any human observer, and the symbolic residue is the youngest layer carried forward in human memory from a period far more recent than the geology that underlies it. The sources are older than the stories. The stories are trying to describe something the geology already contains. What this means for how we understand the investigation is worth holding for a moment without rushing past it. The standard archaeological method moves from surface to depth, from recent material at the top of a stratigraphic sequence to older material at the bottom. The deeper you go, the older the records and the more fundamental the history. This investigation has been moving in the opposite direction from the deepest physical record, which is geological and therefore inhuman, upward through progressively more recent layers of human engagement. With the same underlying reality, first the maps, then the monuments, then the myths. The movement is from the impersonal to the personal, from the geological to the cultural, from the physical to the remembered. And at each step of that movement, some information is lost and some is transformed. But the directional signal south, coastal, inaccessible, cold sealed, persists through every translation. That persistence is what the landscape of this investigation ultimately looks like, read from a distance. Not a collection of anomalies requiring explanation, but a signal that has survived successive translations across different media and different timescales, arriving in the present in degraded but structurally consistent form. The degradation is what the skeptic correctly identifies. No individual trace is strong enough on its own to compel a specific historical conclusion. The structural consistency is what survives the skeptical pressure. The signal is degraded, but it has not been randomized. It still points somewhere. The place it points to is still sealed, and the sealing is itself part of the record, a part of what the geological layer at the bottom of the stratigraphic sequence contains, because the ice that now covers Antarctic coastal margins is the same ice that would have erased any direct physical evidence of the thing the upper layers are trying to remember. What this investigation has produced, read as a landscape rather than as a body of evidence, is a closed loop. The deepest layer explains why the upper layers cannot be verified against it, and the upper layers explain why the deepest layer needs to be asked a question. It cannot currently answer. The loop is not a logical failure. It is the shape of a genuine epistemic limit, the boundary of what current methods can reach, standing at that boundary in the quiet before the final chapters shift. Register entirely. The most honest thing that can be said is also the simplest. This is as far as the evidence takes us, and the distance between here and an answer is not empty. It is full of ice. What the ice does to human memory, how it shapes the psychology of a species that may have lost something to it long before it learned to write, is the territory the next chapter enters. What the ice made of us. Philosophy begins where explanation runs out, not as a failure of explanation, but as its natural terminus. Every discipline has a boundary at which the methods that defined it cease to be sufficient, and what lies beyond that boundary is not nothing. Is the same reality the discipline was examining encountered at a depth where measurement gives way to meaning, where the question shifts from what happened to what it means that it happened, and that we are the ones asking. Archaeology reaches that boundary when the stratigraphy ends and the ice begins. Paleoclimatology reaches it when the climate models have been run and the reconstructed temperatures sit on the screen and someone in the room says quietly, that a species lived through all of this, through every warming and every cooling, every advance and every retreat, every landscape that opened and every landscape that closed, and that the species doing the living eventually became us. At that point, the question stops being scientific and starts being something older and harder to name. That something older is this. What does it do to a species to lose a world? Not to lose a battle or a city or a generation, losses that history, records and cultures metabolize through mourning and reconstruction, but to lose the physical conditions of existence itself. To have the ground become uninhabitable not through violence or failure, but through the slow, indifferent operation of planetary processes that no human decision caused and no human effort could reverse. This is the experience that the geological record of Antarctic cooling describes in its impersonal language of isotope ratios and pollen assemblages and subglacial drainage patterns, translated into human terms into the experience of populations living through that cooling across generations, watching the seasons shorten and the coastlines contract and the familiar routes northward become the only routes available. It describes something that has no precise name in any modern language, because no modern language has been required to name it. The closest available term is exile, but exile implies a place you can return to. This was permanent. The word for permanent exile from a world that ceases to exist is not in the dictionary. It may be in the myths. The Zoroastrian Vara, the underground refuge described in the Vendidad as a response to a divine warning that cold would descend and destroy all surface life, is not usually read as a geological memory. It is read as religious allegory, as an expression of cosmic dualism, as a narrative encoding of the value of preservation against the forces of destruction. These readings are legitimate. They are also possibly not the only readings available. A tradition that describes the construction of a refuge against advancing cold in a language whose oldest layers reach back into the 2nd millennium BCE, and whose geographic orientation places cold as the great existential threat rather than heat or flood, may be carrying something that predates its religious elaboration. A structural memory of a time when cold was not a theological concept but a lived catastrophe advancing generation by generation across landscapes that had previously been productive and inhabited. The religious framework may have grown around the memory the way a tree grows around a nail. The nail is not the tree, but the tree's shape preserves its presence. What ice does to human memory at the deepest level may not be erasure. It may be transformation. The specific information, the coordinates, the names, the sequence of events is erased, but the emotional and cognitive structure of the experience, the knowledge that the world is not obligated to remain hospitable, that stability is conditional, that what exists today may be sealed away tomorrow. Under forces beyond human agency, that structure may persist long after the specific content that generated it has been lost. It persists not as remembered fact, but as inherited disposition, as a particular quality of attention to environmental change, as a cultural emphasis on preservation, on the transmission of knowledge across generations, on the construction of permanence in the face of impermanence. These are the deepest fingerprints of a species that learned very early that the ground beneath it could change. We will not resolve this tonight. That is not what this space is for. But it is worth sitting at the edge of the proposition for a moment before the final chapter closes it, that the civilizations we know, the river valley cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus and the Yellow River, the megalithic traditions of Atlantic Europe, the astronomical sophistication of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica may all share beneath their regional diversity a common inheritance that is not genetic or linguistic but existential. The inheritance of a species that knows in its oldest layers of cultural memory that worlds end, that the conditions of life are temporary, that the appropriate response to inhabiting a world is not the assumption of its permanence, but the careful, sustained effort to preserve what matters across the transitions that will inevitably come. Antarctica is on this reading not an origin in the geographic sense. It is an origin in the philosophical sense, the place where the human relationship to impermanence was first tested at a scale that left permanent marks on the species that survived it. The ice that now covers it is not a tomb. It is a record of the test, and the cultures that came after all of them, in their different ways, building monuments to cycles and encoding the memory of lost worlds in their stories and orienting their most sacred structures toward the extremes of solar return, may be the long echo of a lesson learned so early and so completely that it outlasted the classroom, the teacher, and the name of the subject being taught. The cosmological implication held quietly rather than proclaimed is that human civilization may not be the story of a species rising from simplicity to complexity in a series of progressive stages. It may be the story of a species reconstructing in place after place across 10,000 years of recorded history, a complexity it once possessed and lost reassembling from fragments carried forward through every medium available to it. The outline of a knowledge that the ice took away before anyone learned to write it down. The final chapter holds one image, a single physical detail, specific and quiet, that contains all of this in miniature, not as argument but as rest. The tree that remembered summer. In a storage drawer in the Geology's department of a university in New Zealand, wrapped in acid-free tissue and catalogued under a specimen, number that most people will never have reason to look up. There is a piece of fossil wood approximately the size of a human forearm. It was extracted from a rock formation in the Antarctic mountains during a field season in the early 1990s carried out by helicopter to a research camp flown to Christchurch in a padded case and eventually transferred to permanent storage where it has remained largely undisturbed for 3 decades. The wood is 260 million years old. Its surface, where the researchers cut a thin section for microscopic analysis, reveals the internal structure of the original tree with extraordinary clarity, cell walls preserved in silica. The annual growth rings still legible as alternating bands of dense and open tissue, the record of the tree's life encoded in the geometry of its own fossilized body. The growth rings are the thing worth holding. Each one represents a single year in the life of a tree that grew in Antarctica during the Permian period, when the continent occupied lower latitudes and the climate permitted forests of a kind that no longer exist anywhere on Earth in quite that form. The wide rings represent years of strong growth, long summers, adequate rainfall, warm soil, the full productive capacity of a temperate ecosystem operating without constraint. The narrow rings represent years of stress, shorter seasons, reduced light, the tree doing what trees do in difficult years, which is to survive at reduced capacity while waiting for conditions to improve. The sequence of wide and narrow rings is not random. It has a rhythm. Periods of strong growth alternate with periods of stress in a pattern that paleoclimatologists can read as a record of the climate variability the tree experienced across its lifetime, decades of warmth, followed by decades of marginal conditions, the whole sequence compressed into a cross-section, the diameter of a dinner plate. What the growth rings preserve, in other words, is not just the fact of the tree's existence, but the texture of the world it existed in. Not a static world, not a frozen one, a world with seasons and variation, and the kind of long-term climatic instability that required living things to carry within their own bodies a record of what they had survived. The tree did not choose to make this record. It was made by the tree's growth year by year, as an incidental consequence of being alive in a place where seasons existed and mattered. The record was not intended for us. It has no audience in mind. It simply is a physical fact sitting in a drawer in Christchurch, waiting with the patience of something that has already waited 260 million years for the next person who thinks to ask what it contains. There is something in that patience worth resting with as this episode closes. Not the patience of stone, which is geological and impersonal, but the patience of a record of something that was made by living processes in a living world and that has carried through every transformation the planet has undergone since the specific information of those summers and those winters and those years of marginal survival. The Antarctic ice came after this tree. The ice ground down the landscape where it grew, sealed the valley where it fell, compressed everything above it into layers that will not be disturbed for millions more years. The ice did not destroy the tree's record. It buried it, and burial, unlike destruction, is a form of keeping. The investigation this episode has been conducting through fossils and maps and stone monuments and the oldest stories human cultures know how to tell has been, in the deepest sense, an attempt to read a record that was not made for us in a language that was not designed to be read. The subglacial canyons were not carved as messages. The growth rings were not laid down as archives. The early maps were not compiled as clues. The mythological traditions were not preserved as evidence. They are all, in their different ways, incidental records, the byproducts of processes that were doing something else entirely, Something as simple and as fundamental as growing or flowing or trying to remember where home was, or trying to describe a world that no longer existed to children who had never seen it. The tree in the drawer in Christchurch grew in a forest. The forest stood on a coastline. The coastline faced an ocean that has since rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. The tree fell at some point into sediment that preserved it. And the sediment became rock, and the rock became mountain, and the mountain became part of the Transantarctic range, and the range became buried under ice, and the ice became the surface of the continent. We now call by a name that means simply South Antarctica, the place opposite the north defined by its direction from everywhere else, rather than by anything it contains in itself. What it contains in itself in the drawer in Christchurch, and in the sealed canyons, and in the compressed sediment layers, and in the faint directionality of stories told by people who never knew why they were telling them in that direction, what it contains is a record of something that was once alive in a place that has since become the definition of lifelessness, waiting with the same patience the growth rings display for the question that is specific enough to read them. That question has not been fully formed yet. This episode has been one attempt to form it. The ice still holds the answer, or holds whatever is down there, instead of an answer at a depth that current methods cannot reach. The tree in the drawer is as close as we can get tonight. One piece of a world that existed specific and physical, and 260 million years old, carrying its record of summers in a place that no longer has them. Rest now, traveller. The tree is still there. Not in the mountains, those have been sealed under ice for longer than our species has existed, but in the drawer in Christchurch, in the acid-free tissue, in the geometry of its own fossilized cells. The growth rings are still legible. Wide years and narrow years, the rhythm of a climate that no one living has ever felt preserved in the body of a tree that did not know it was preserving anything at all. It was simply growing the way living things grow in a place that allowed it. The place stopped allowing it. The tree fell. The ice came. And 260 million years later, someone thought to cut a thin section and look, and the summers were still there, visible, specific, patient, in a way that has nothing to do with intention and everything to do with the simple durability of silica in rock. That is where this episode began, and that is where it ends, not with an answer, but with a specimen, with something physical that can be held and measured and read, that caches real information about a real world, and that cannot tell us, will never be able to tell us, whether anyone ever walked in the forest it once belonged to. That gap between what the record contains and what we most want to know is not a failure of the record. It is the record's honest limit. And honest limits held quietly rather than argued against are where something like rest becomes possible. The investigations this episode conducted covered a great deal of ground: geological, cartographic, astronomical, mythological, and arrived as this kind of investigation usually does, not at a destination, but at a clearer sense of the terrain. The pattern is real in the sense that 4 independent bodies of evidence lean in the same direction. The pattern is unresolved in the sense that no available method can reach the place it points toward. These 2 facts coexist without contradiction. They describe the condition that most honest inquiry eventually finds itself in, standing at the edges of what can be known, looking at what cannot yet be reached, and recognizing that the distance between the two is not empty but full of ice, full of time, full of the accumulated patience of things that have been waiting longer than we have been asking. It is not necessary to know what is down there tonight. It has waited this long. It will wait through your sleep and through the sleep of everyone who listens to this, and through seasons and decades that none of us will be alive to see. Whatever the Antarctic coastal margins contain, whether it is only the ancient canyons and the subglacial rivers and the compressed sediment of forests no one walked through, or whether it is something more, it is not going anywhere. The ice is holding it, and the ice, for all its violence, is also a kind of keeping. Stories will still be there in the morning, the maps will still be in the archives, the monuments will still be aligned to the same solstice they were built to mark. The growth rings in the specimen drawer will still be wide and narrow in the same sequence they have maintained for 260 million years. None of this requires your attention tonight. None of it asks anything of you right now except the willingness to let it rest at the edge of awareness present in it, but not pressing, interesting, but not urgent, the way a very old question sits in the mind of someone who has learned that not all questions are improved by forcing them toward answers. One thing lingers gently as the episode dissolves: if the oldest layers of human memory carry something they cannot name about a world that closed before the naming began. What else might be carried in us below the threshold of the articulable, below the reach of any archive waiting in the body, the way warmth waits in stone long after the sun has moved on? Let the breath slow. Let the weight of the body become the weight of the ground beneath it, which is older than anything you have heard tonight, and will remain long after every record of this conversation is gone. The Transantarctic mountains are still standing in the dark on the other side of the planet in the cold that has no urgency under a sky that turns without stopping. The tree in the drawer is still exactly what it was. The ice is still keeping what it keeps. Rest now, traveller. The ice is patient, and so for tonight are we.